I still remember that afternoon as if it just happened yesterday. The sun was dipping low, painting the sky in warm golds and soft pinks, and I was standing by the porch steps, waving goodbye to my daughter and grandson after our usual Sunday lunch. Everything felt peaceful, almost too peaceful. Then suddenly my little grandson ran back toward me, his small feet pattering against the gravel, his eyes wide with something I couldn't quite understand. He grabbed my hand and said, trembling a little, "Don't go home, Grandma." At first I laughed. It sounded so odd, so out of place. What could he possibly mean by that? I told him gently that I was home, that this was my house, my garden, my comfort zone, but he just shook his head, eyes darting toward the road, as if something terrible was waiting out there. His voice dropped to a whisper, "Please, don't go back home tonight. You know, when you've lived long enough, you start thinking you've seen it all." I thought maybe he'd seen something on television or overheard the grown-ups talking about scary things. Kids have such wild imaginations, don't they? So I bent down, patted his cheek, and told him everything was fine. But the way he looked at me, oh, that look. It wasn't just fear, it was knowing. Like somehow deep down he sensed something I couldn't. I brushed it off, of course. Told my daughter it was nothing, that maybe he was just tired or had a bad dream. She agreed, but I caught her glancing back at me more than once as they drove away. I watched their car disappear down the road, then turned to go inside. The wind picked up a bit, making the chimes on my porch sing in that eerie, hollow way they do when a storm's coming. I paused, staring at the horizon. Everything felt different, heavier. I wish I'd listened to that little voice in my heart, the one that whispered, "Something isn't right," but I'm stubborn, always have been. I told myself not to get carried away, not to make a fuss over a child's words. Besides, what could possibly happen in the same home I'd lived in for 30 years? Still, I couldn't shake the image of his tiny hands gripping mine, the urgency in his voice. That night, as I locked the doors and turned off the lights, those words echoed in my mind. "Don't go home, Grandma." They circled around my thoughts like a restless wind. I made myself a cup of tea, sat in my favorite chair, and tried to laugh it off again. But laughter doesn't come easy when the world suddenly feels quieter than usual. You start hearing things you'd normally ignore. The creak of the floorboards, the hum of the refrigerator, the faint rustle outside your window. Every sound felt amplified, every shadow stretched a little longer than it should. I kept telling myself it was just my imagination, that I was letting a child's words get under my skin. But deep down, a small, cold pit of worry had already formed in my stomach. It's strange how moments like that feel both ordinary and unforgettable. There was nothing dramatic, no flashing signs or thunderclaps, just a quiet house, a cooling cup of tea, and a heart that wouldn't settle. And yet that was the moment everything started to change, though I didn't know it then. I look back now and think about how life has a way of warning us in whispers before it screams. My grandson's plea was one of those whispers, gentle, urgent, and easy to dismiss. If only I had understood what he was really trying to tell me, because by the time I realized it, it was already too late. After that strange little warning, life seemed to fall back into its usual rhythm, and I convinced myself there was nothing to worry about. The next morning, the world felt calm and ordinary, the kind of day where you almost forget anything unsettling ever happened. I made my tea, fed the cat, and stepped outside to water the flowers. The air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of damp earth and the promise of rain. Everything looked so normal, the white fence, the sound of distant chatter from the neighbors, even the mailman waving as he passed by. It was as if the world itself was trying to tell me, "See, there's nothing wrong." But even then, a small part of me couldn't forget the way my grandson had looked at me the day before. His words lingered like an echo that refused to fade, and though I tried to ignore it, there was something heavy in the air, something that made the quiet feel just a little too quiet. Still, I kept busy. That's what we do, isn't it? We bury unease beneath routine. I dusted the shelves, straightened the curtains, baked a pie just to make the house smell warm again. In the afternoon, I decided to sit on the porch with a book. The breeze was soft, the sunlight dappled through the trees, and for a while, everything felt peaceful again, the kind of peace that makes you forget how fragile safety really is. The sound of crickets began to hum, a steady background to my thoughts, and I remember thinking how silly it had been to let a child's fear get to me. Children say things, strange things sometimes, and we, the adults, are supposed to be the ones who know better. But as the day slipped into evening, something shifted. The wind grew colder, sharper. The chimes that had once sounded cheerful now felt hollow, mournful, like they were trying to say something I couldn't quite understand. I went inside, turned on the radio, and tried to fill the silence with noise. But every song seemed too slow, every voice too far away. There was a stillness that settled into the house, a stillness that didn't feel like peace anymore. It felt like waiting. I made myself dinner, though I wasn't hungry. The spoon clinked against the bowl, echoing louder than it should have. It's strange how a familiar home can suddenly feel foreign. The walls were the same, the furniture hadn't moved, but the feeling had changed. Like the house itself was holding its breath. I tried to shake it off again even. Laughed at myself for being foolish. I told myself I was just lonely, that maybe I was reading too many mystery novels. Still, I couldn't ignore how the air felt heavier somehow, how even the shadows seemed to linger longer before fading. That night, as I stepped outside to lock the front gate, I caught sight of something. Or maybe it was nothing, at the edge of the woods behind my garden. A faint flicker of movement, gone before I could be sure. Probably an animal, I told myself, probably. But that's when I noticed how quiet everything had become. No crickets, no rustling leaves, not even the sound of the wind. Just silence, deep and thick, the kind that presses against your ears. I hurried back inside, locked the door, and leaned against it for a moment, listening. Nothing, not a sound. I almost called my daughter then just to hear another voice, but I stopped myself. I didn't want to worry her over nothing. So instead, I sat back in my chair, turned on the lamp beside me, and told myself again that everything was fine. But somewhere deep inside, I knew the calm I was feeling wasn't real. It wasn't peace. It was the kind of quiet that comes right before something happens. I just didn't know what that something was. Not yet. Looking back now, I realized there were signs, small ones, subtle enough that I brushed them aside without a second thought. It's funny how hindsight turns whispers into shouts. At the time, though, I convinced myself everything was perfectly ordinary. The first thing I noticed was the phone. It started ringing at odd hours, always just one or two rings before stopping. When I picked it up, there was nothing but silence on the other end. I told myself it was a wrong number, some glitch, or maybe those scam calls that never seemed to end. But it happened 3 nights in a row, each time around the same hour, just past 11. I remember setting the phone back down on its cradle, the soft click echoing a little too loud in that still house. Then there was the neighbor. Old Mr. Riley, who lived 2 houses down, usually waved whenever I went to fetch the mail. One morning he didn't. He just stood there, staring at my driveway like he'd seen something. When I called out a hello, he startled, actually flinched, and mumbled something about being late before hurrying inside. I remember frowning, wondering if maybe he wasn't feeling well. I almost went over to check on him, but something stopped me, a strange unease I couldn't quite name. Even the animal seemed different. My cat, who usually curled up at my feet every night, started refusing to come inside. She'd sit near the edge of the porch, tail flicking, eyes fixed toward the back of the house. I'd try to coax her in, but she'd only hiss softly and run off toward the bushes. The first night it happened, I laughed and said aloud, "Suit yourself." But the second night, when I found her fur puffed up and ears pinned back, staring into the darkness like she saw something I didn't, that laughter didn't come so easily. Inside, I began to notice little things out of place. A photo frame slightly turned on the mantel, the kitchen door not fully shut when I was sure I'd closed it. I even started writing these things off as signs of forgetfulness. I told myself, "You're just getting older, that's all." I clung to that excuse because the alternative, that someone or something else had touched those things, was too uncomfortable to consider. The nights grew heavier. I started keeping a light on in the hallway, just a small one, telling myself it was for convenience if I needed to get up, but really it was because I couldn't stand the pitch darkness anymore. It felt like the shadows were waiting, watching. Once I woke up in the middle of the night and thought I heard footsteps outside my bedroom door. Slow, deliberate steps. My heart froze. I listened, barely breathing, until I convinced myself it must have been the old pipes creaking or the wind brushing against the shutters. I didn't even check. I just lay there staring at the ceiling, counting the seconds until dawn. Every instinct in me was whispering that something wasn't right, but I kept finding ways to rationalize it. Maybe because that's easier, to pretend everything is fine rather than face what could be wrong. I even remember telling my daughter over the phone that week, "This old house just makes too many noises, that's all." She offered to come over, but I insisted I was fine, proud, stubborn, unwilling to admit that fear had started to creep in through the cracks of my calm. Now, when I think about those little signs, the phone calls, the cat, the creaking sounds, the neighbor's strange silence, I realized they were all trying to tell me the same thing. Something was building, something unseen but close. I just didn't want to believe it. And that's the cruel thing about warnings. They don't stop coming just because we choose not to listen. It was a Thursday evening when everything finally started to make sense. Or rather, when all the little things I'd been ignoring came crashing together into something I couldn't ignore anymore. The day had been ordinary, just like the ones before it. I spent the morning tidying up, folding laundry, and humming along to an old song on the radio. The sun was shining, the house smelled faintly of lemon polish, and for the first time in a week, I felt calm again. I told myself I'd been silly, letting fear live rent-free in my mind. But as the afternoon faded into evening, that uneasy feeling crept back, quiet but steady, like a chill sneaking under the door. The sky outside turned an odd shade of gray, not stormy but heavy, as if it was holding its breath. I was just finishing my dinner when I heard it, a faint knock. Not on the front door, but on the back one, the one that led to the garden. 3 soft knocks, then silence. At first I froze, the fork hung midair, and I listened, straining to hear it again. Nothing. I told myself it was probably a branch, maybe the wind. I got up, went to the window, and peered out into the darkness. The porch light flickered for a moment before settling, and I could just make out the edge of the garden. Still, quiet, almost too quiet. No movement, no sound. I was about to turn away when I saw it. The faintest glimmer of light near the old shed, like the reflection of metal. It vanished as quickly as it appeared. Something in my chest tightened. I tried to shake it off, muttering to myself that I was being ridiculous. I locked the back door and went to the living room to distract myself with the television, but the signal kept cutting in and out, the picture flickering with static. Then, during one of those flickers, I saw something, a shadow crossing the edge of the window behind me. My body went cold. I turned around so fast I nearly dropped the remote, but there was nothing there, only the curtain swaying slightly, as if a draft had brushed past. My heart was pounding now. I told myself to calm down, to think logically. I even laughed, a nervous, shaky laugh that didn't sound like mine. But then I heard it again, this time not a knock but a slow creak, like the back door easing open. I knew I had locked it. I knew. The air shifted. That's the only way I can describe it. The house suddenly felt alive, listening, breathing, waiting. I stood there barely able to move. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but where to? I grabbed my phone with trembling hands and tried to call my daughter. No signal, not even a single bar. The lights flickered once, twice, then steadied again. I took a step toward the kitchen, and that's when I saw it. The muddy footprint just inside the doorway, one single print, fresh. My breath caught in my throat. Someone had been, or still was, inside. I didn't make a sound. I backed away slowly, praying that whoever it was couldn't hear the pounding in my chest. I reached the hallway and slipped quietly into the small closet under the stairs, closing the door until only a sliver of light came through. I could hear the faint creak of floorboards, the slow movement of someone walking across my living room. Minutes felt like hours. I stayed as still as I could, hands shaking, tears rolling silently down my cheeks. Then, just as suddenly as it started, the sound stopped. Silence filled the house again, that same heavy, waiting silence that had haunted me for days. When I finally found the courage to step out, the back door was wide open, swinging gently in the night breeze, and on the porch, caught under the dim porch light, lay my grandson's toy car, the one he'd lost weeks ago, the one I swore I'd looked everywhere for. That was the moment I knew. He hadn't been warning me out of fear. He'd been warning me out of love. And I should have listened. The days that followed were a blur of fear and disbelief, the kind of days where you move through time, but nothing feels quite real. I called my daughter first thing the next morning, my voice trembling as I tried to explain what had happened, the footprints, the open door, the toy car that shouldn't have been there. She rushed over with my grandson, her face pale and eyes wide, glancing around the house like she was expecting to find someone still hiding inside. We checked every room, every corner, every lock. Everything looked normal again, too normal, like the house was mocking me for being afraid. but I could still feel it, the wrongness, the invisible weight that hung in the air. The police came later that afternoon. They were kind but skeptical, asking the same questions over and over. Was I sure the door had been locked? Could someone in the family have visited and forgotten to mention it? Maybe an animal had wandered in? I wanted to believe them, I really did, but the footprints were too clear, too human. And that toy, that tiny red car sitting where it didn't belong, how could I explain that? They took a report, walked around the property, and said they'd keep an eye on the neighborhood. Then they left, leaving me standing in that empty living room, clutching my grandson's toy in my hand. That night, I stayed at my daughter's house. I didn't want to, not out of stubbornness, but because a part of me couldn't bear to feel like a burden. Still, she insisted, and I finally agreed. My grandson was quiet that evening. Usually he'd chatter endlessly at the dinner table, but that night he just stared down at his plate. When I reached over and touched his hand, he looked up at me with those same serious eyes and said softly, "I told you not to go home." My heart sank. I didn't know how to respond. What could I say to a child who somehow knew something I didn't? I squeezed his hand and whispered, "I know, sweetheart. I should have listened." We went back to my house the next morning to gather a few things, and as soon as I stepped through the door, that feeling hit me again. Cold, heavy, suffocating. The air smelled different, faintly metallic, like wet iron. My daughter tried to make light conversation, but I could hear the unease in her voice. She checked the back door. It was still unlocked, though she swore she'd seen me turn the key before we left. And then in the kitchen, she found the phone off the hook, dangling by its cord. None of us had touched it. That's when she said I shouldn't stay there anymore. Not for a while. She said maybe it was time to sell the house, move closer to them, somewhere safer. I wanted to argue, to tell her this was still my home, the place where I'd built my life, raised my children, planted my garden. But deep down, I knew she was right. The house didn't feel like home anymore. It felt like a memory that had turned on me. Something that no longer recognized the person living inside it. Leaving that place broke something in me. It wasn't just the fear, it was the guilt. I kept replaying that moment in my mind, the one where my grandson tried to warn me. If I had just listened, maybe none of it would have happened. Maybe I wouldn't have to leave behind everything I loved. Sometimes, even now, I still dream about that house. The way the light used to spill through the curtains in the morning, the creak of the floors, the sound of wind through the trees. And in those dreams, I hear his voice again, soft and pleading, "Don't go home, Grandma." I wake up before I ever reach the porch, and maybe that's for the best. Time has a strange way of softening things, even the moments that once made your heart race. It's been a while since that night, and yet there are times when the memory feels as fresh as yesterday. Other days, it drifts in like a shadow, quiet but familiar. I've learned to live with it, the what-ifs, the could-haves, the things I should have seen but didn't. I suppose that's the hardest part of growing older. You realize too late that warnings don't always come wrapped in logic. Sometimes they come through the people who love you most, and sometimes they sound like a child, trembling voice asking you not to go home. For a long time, I carried guilt like a weight on my chest. I kept thinking about all the signs I ignored, all the ways I brushed off my instincts. I told myself I was being practical, that I was being brave, when really I was just afraid of seeming foolish. It's strange, isn't it, how pride can disguise itself as reason. I used to think being strong meant standing your ground no matter what, but I've come to understand that sometimes strength is in listening, in trusting the feelings that make no sense but won't let go. After I moved in with my daughter, life slowed down in a way that felt both comforting and unfamiliar. I no longer had the quiet mornings in my old garden, no porch chimes singing in the breeze. No familiar creaks to remind me of years gone by. But I had warmth again. Laughter at the breakfast table, the smell of pancakes on Sundays, and the sound of my grandson's feet running across the hallway. He never spoke much about that day, and I never asked. Some things I think are better left unspoken. We just share a look now and then. The kind of look that says, "And I remember too." I often sit by the window in the evenings, watching the light fade over the trees, and I think about how fragile safety is, how one choice, one decision to ignore a small voice can change the entire shape of your life. But I also think about how love has its own way of protecting us, even when it comes in forms we don't understand. My grandson's warning wasn't just fear, it was love trying to reach me before the world did its damage. That's something I'll never forget. There are moments when I still dream of my old house. Sometimes it's peaceful, sunlight spilling through the curtains, birds chirping by the window. Other times, the house stands empty, quiet, untouched, as if waiting for someone who will never return. I always wake before I step inside, and each time I whisper a little thank you into the dark, not out of fear anymore, but out of gratitude. Gratitude that I was given a second chance, that I was loved enough to be warned. If there's one thing I've learned, it's that life rarely shouts its lessons. It whispers them gently, persistently, through the people who care, through the moments that unsettle us, through the instincts we try so hard to ignore. And if we're wise enough or humble enough to listen, we might save ourselves a world of regret. I used to think my grandson's words haunted me, but now I understand they saved me, because sometimes the warnings that sound like fear are really love trying to keep us safe.